The phrase 3 days and 3 nights is the globally recognized timeline for the crucifixion and burial of Jesus of Nazareth. A Friday afternoon burial to a Sunday morning resurrection spans roughly 39 hours. That contains parts of 3 calendar days, but explicitly only 2 nights. Resolving this tension requires abandoning modern Western assumptions. By analyzing ancient bioforensic idioms and the literal Greek syntax of the earliest manuscripts, the traditional chronology falls apart entirely. The first step is redefining death itself. We have to separate the modern medical understanding of biology from the way the ancient Near East legally defined the end of life. From there, we must examine the 72-hour boundary, a strict cultural and medical necessity in the ancient world, used to confirm irreversible death. Finally, we will look at the calendar mechanics of the first century to show that the common explanations for a shortened timeline are linguistically incompatible with the actual sequence of events. The chronological accounts in the Gospels are precise legal and forensic documents. To decode them, we must read them through the eyes of the people who wrote them. In the biblical framework, life is the functional integration of the breath, or neshama, and circulating blood, the dam. The text establishes a literal identity. The life of the flesh is the blood. Death, therefore, begins at a singular ontological point. It occurs the exact moment the animating spirit, the pneuma, departs the physical vessel. Modern medicine defines the subsequent decomposition at a microscopic level. The process is driven by autolysis, or cellular self-digestion. The moment the heart stops pumping blood, oxygen deprivation turns intracellular fluid acidic. Cell membranes rupture, releasing digestive enzymes that dissolve the tissue from the inside out. This microscopic destruction begins within minutes of heart failure. Ancient societies lacked microscopes, cytology, and a working knowledge of bacteria. They could not observe cell death, so they relied entirely on macroscopic, visible proof of physical decay. This diagram compares our modern pathological timeline on the left with the ancient forensic standard on the right. Ancient cultures referred to this macroscopic stage of decay as corruption, or diaphthora. Diaphthora is identified by specific, observable markers. Internal bacterial gases build up, causing tissue bloating. The facial features swell until they are unrecognizable, and volatile sulfur gases escape, producing a stark, foul odor. In the warm, arid climates of the ancient Near East, these undeniable markers of putrefaction reliably peak around the 3rd day. Ancient people measured the reality of death strictly by what they could verify with their raw human senses. If the body was not yet visibly rotting, the state of death remained forensically unverified. This 72-hour window served a highly practical function. It acted as a societal safeguard against accidentally burying someone alive who might be trapped in a deep coma or a temporary swoon. Because early decomposition is invisible to the naked eye, a body might appear pristine and simply unresponsive for a day or two. Ancient legal standards adapted to this by restricting the forensic identification of a corpse strictly to this 3-day parameter. The Mishnah Yevamot codifies this exact rule. It dictates that judicial testimony identifying a corpse is completely invalidated after 3 days because facial decay makes the individual legally unrecognizable. This aligned with the theological anthropology of the period. Rabbinic texts like the Bereshit Rabbah maintained that the soul hovered near the grave for 3 days, departing definitively only when the countenance of the face visibly changed. These judicial and anthropological standards form the exact basis of the idiom 3 days and 3 nights. Reaching that 72-hour line does not mean decomposition is biologically starting. It is the sensory and legal boundary confirming that microscopic destruction has finally and permanently conquered the vessel. We see this forensic standard strictly applied in the Gospel of John. Upon hearing that his friend Lazarus was sick, Jesus made a highly calculated decision to remain stationary for 2 additional days. This chart contrasts the 2 burial timelines. The objective of the delay on the left was to guarantee that Lazarus crossed that 72-hour threshold and entered the 4th day. The text provides explicit forensic proof of his status. On the 4th day, Martha offers sensory confirmation, stating that the body possesses a foul odor. The threshold of corruption had been crossed. Because of this decay, the raising of Lazarus is strictly defined as a resuscitation. He was returned to mortal biological life. He emerged bound in grave clothes, subject to aging, and destined to die a second time. The messianic timeline on the right operates under completely different parameters. It was intentionally compressed to avoid the biological curse of corruption entirely. A 72-hour observation buffer wasn't required to prove Jesus was dead. Roman executioners provided instant forensic verification of somatic death on the cross. The fatal spear thrust to the heart, producing blood and water, confirmed absolute biological failure before burial. Furthermore, a prophetic constraint from the Book of Psalms explicitly forbade the Holy One from ever seeing diaphthora. The body could not remain in the tomb long enough to rot. This lack of corruption defines the event as a true resurrection, an ontological and permanent transition into an immortal, incorruptible state. Lazarus had to rot to empirically prove he died as a mortal. Jesus had to strictly avoid rotting to prove he rose as an immortal. So how does a timeline that must avoid corruption square with the sign of 3 days and 3 nights? The primary historical defense for the 39-hour Good Friday model relies on an ancient timekeeping rule known as inclusive reckoning. Under inclusive reckoning, any fraction of a 24-hour block legally counts as an entire day. In the Book of Esther, a fast is called for 3 days, night or day, yet it resolves on the 3rd day, demonstrating that 72 literal hours were not required. Using this logic, late Friday, Saturday, and early Sunday count as 3 days. But there is a fatal linguistic flaw in applying this idiom to the gospel burial time frame. This calendar grid tracks the original Greek syntax of Matthew chapter 28, verse 1. The verse opens with the phrase, "Opse de Sabbaton." The word Sabbaton is a genitive plural. It literally translates to "after the Sabbaths." The text confirms that multiple Sabbaths occurred during Passion Week. The Gospel of John identifies the first Sabbath. It explicitly states that the day following the crucifixion was a high day, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which functions as a holy convocation regardless of the day of the week. The second Sabbath mentioned in the plural syntax is the standard weekly seventh-day Saturday Sabbath. The Gospel of Mark introduces a chronological wedge between these two dates. The text indicates the women bought spices after a Sabbath had passed, but Luke states they prepared those spices before resting on the Sabbath. This requires a standard workday sandwiched between the two holy days. Ancient Jewish culture did not observe partial Sabbaths. They are strict, unbroken 24-hour blocks of complete rest. Sequencing a high Sabbath, a regular workday, and a weekly Saturday Sabbath mathematically shatters the Friday model. It mandates a literal 72-hour midweek timeline, pushing the crucifixion to Wednesday and rendering the inclusive reckoning loophole irrelevant. The phrase 3 days and 3 nights operates as a rigorous bioforensic standard, utilized by ancient legal frameworks to verify absolute physical finality. By utilizing a midweek timeline, the events satisfy the requirement for verifiable somatic death across a literal 3-day span, while raising the body before it triggered the biological corruption of the 4th day. Applying modern cytological pathology to ancient texts forces them to answer microscopic questions they were never designed to address, creating false contradictions and obscuring the author's actual intent. The original Greek syntax of the earliest manuscripts explicitly demands a literal, prolonged duration in the grave, a detail that centuries of Western tradition have largely ignored. When stripped of modern biological assumptions and analyzed through ancient Near Eastern legal, medical, and linguistic lenses, the timeline of the empty tomb is not a contradictory metaphor. It is exactingly precise.